大家好，咁我而家咧就喺溫哥華嘅士丹利公園啦。咁今日都係好凍，但係咧個天氣都好好哈。咁我而家咧就坐馬車就遊呢個士丹利公園。咁啊喺呢一集入邊咧，阿卡姐就唔出聲啦嚇，就唔講嘢啦。咁啊俾大家欣賞下呢個士丹利公園好靚嘅嚇。咁啊嗱，而家我哋咧就開始咯喎，遊呢個公園咯喎。
First?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, folks, we are off and on our way here. We'll just break from the gates and we're away to the races. 0 to 3 in 2 seconds. And there's a cormorant right out there. It just caught a fish. Oh, seagulls after it too. A little bit of drama at the start of the tour. Well, welcome aboard AAA Horse and Carriage Tours on our tour of the east side of Stanley Park. My name is Hal. I'll be your driver and tour guide, or teamster as we were once known, kind of like that. But as we journey around the park, I'll be talking a little bit about the history, the attractions, natural history, and landmarks here in the park. But of course, I'll be talking about our main event up front here, the horses. Today we have a pair of Percheron horses. Well, our story begins with Jim on the left. Jim is a 13-year-old Percheron. Well, he's a bit of an unusual color for a Percheron. Many Percherons are black or gray. He's got a black base coat with white hairs. Gives him a bit of a bluish tinge to his coat, and so he is known as a blue roan. We also have his brother in our barn, another blue roan. They're a fine, handsome team when they go out together, but they are named for Jim Beam and Jack Daniels. But on our right is Grit. Grit is a 17-year-old Percheron. Well, he is our biggest boy in the barn. He stands 19 hands tall. That's 6'4" at the shoulders or withers. And, well, he weighs about 2,400 pounds. These guys are each about the size of a small car, but in comparison to a racehorse, a thoroughbred racehorse will average about 1,200 pounds, so Grit is 2 in 1. And for 40 years now, since 1982, AAA Horse and Carriage has been providing tours of Stanley Park, doing film and television work as well as weddings and other special events. Percherons were originally, there's our cormorant on the rock here. Percherons were originally bred in the La Perche area of France. They're known for their strength, their versatility, their intelligence, their calm, easygoing natures, as well as their willingness to work. There's the cormorant in its classic wing spread position. But draft horses like these were originally bred way back in the medieval times. They were necessary to carry the burden of the knights with their heavy armor. And though gunpowder was pretty much the end for the knights, it was just the beginning for these guys. For example, in 1911, through the western prairie provinces of Canada, where much of the food production is grown, we had 1.2 million of these horses back then. That represented 6 horses for every farmer. But by the 1920s, and with the advent of mechanized farm equipment such as the tractor, these numbers dramatically declined almost to the point of extinction for some of these breeds over their history. By 1950, in the American Percheron stud book, which registers the number of Percheron horses bred each year, there was only 70 entries in that year, which contrasted with thousands at the turn of the century. But they carried on through this time and beyond, largely due to communities such as the Amish communities, who rejected mechanized farm equipment and carried on breeding and working these horses. So today we have many of these horses all over the world doing all kinds of different work. Well, the Amish preferred this method of farming because the horses would rear their own replacements, they would produce their own fuel and fertilizer. Well, Stanley Park was originally set aside as a Vancouver was incorporated as a city back in 1886. Just a couple of months after incorporation, it became victim to the Great Fire of Vancouver. On June 13, 1886, high winds whipped up a brush-clearing fire, which swept out of control, and within 45 minutes, all the wooden structures had burned to the ground, leaving only 2 stone structures remaining. Well, one of these stone structures was the St. James Church, and though the structure survived, the bell at the church was melted down to slag and can be seen at the Museum of Vancouver to this day. About 20 people perished in the fire, though we'll never know for sure due to the transient population of the time. Population back then. But just beyond the Chevron gas station for boats on our right, we see a white building with orange trim. This is Canada Place. It's a cruise ship terminal and convention center, with the convention center portion capable of hosting 5,000 people to a formal dinner. It was established in 1986 during our centennial year and the year that we hosted Expo. Just over to the right of Canada Place is another building with a long, flat, green roof, and this is Convention Center West. It was established in 2009, but used in the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics. It's used as an international broadcast center. It's got the most sustainable features available today, such as a 6-acre living roof with 400,000 individual grass plants on top, as well as an enhanced marine environment, which has greatly increased the marine population of the area. My personal feeling, I think we should have some goats up on the roof. What do you think? But we are approaching the Stanley Park collection of totem poles. We will be making a brief stop here. These poles represent the unique carving styles of people of the Northwest BC coast as well as Lower Alaska. And as we make our way throughout BC at all kinds of different gatherings, we will hear the phrase, "We live and work on the unceded ground of the First Nations." This refers to the fact that no treaties or agreements had ever been struck between the First People and the people who occupied the land, so it's a recognition that we live and work on the traditional territory of the First Nations today. And as I mentioned, we will be making a brief stop here. I've got 2 o'clock. If you'd like to come back here in about 5 minutes at 2:05, that would be fantastic. As we pass by HMCS Discovery, I'd like to point out to you the emblem on the gates and the sign. We see a golden disc over a white Y. Well, this forms a rebus or word puzzle. Is anyone able to come up with the answer to the word puzzle, disc over Y? That's right, good for you. As you discovered when you placed the words disc over Y, it was about 1,000 people. Today in Vancouver we have 662,000, with 5.2 million making up the population of British Columbia, about 53% of which is Greater Vancouver. Well, Stanley Park was originally set aside as a military reserve back in 1863. 1,000 acres or 405 hectares was set aside, and it didn't officially become a park until September 27, 1888. Today, Stanley Park is 157 acres bigger than New York City's Central Park and BC's #1 tourist attraction with about 8 million guests on a non-pandemic year. Just on our left, we see a parking lot. Fascinating, I know, but back in the 1880s, there was a little bit more excitement there. We had a pig farm which was established there by a Chinese family, while others who lived and worked in the park at this time were people who had jumped off the ships, making their living farming and fishing and settling the area. And of course, First Nations who have lived here throughout millennia. Well, in 1888, a smallpox epidemic swept through the area. So by 1890, the mayor had decreed all so-called squatters be removed from the park. Though First Nations certainly cannot be considered squatters, they were affected greatly by the eviction as well as by the epidemic. Although some people managed to live on in the park until the 1930s, however. Well, as we peek through the trees on our right, we see a bridge to an island with a red brick building on it. This is known today as HMCS Discovery, or His Majesty's Canadian Ship Discovery, and it is a naval reserve which dates back to 1944 in this location. They provided recruitment and training during the Second World War. They were able to supply 8,000 personnel towards the war effort. But today it's home to several reserve and cadet units. Well, the island was also once the site of lighthouses lost their utility after the advent of GPS. Oh, what a beautiful often depicted at the very top of the totem poles. And this was because it was considered the ruler of the upper world. Sometimes we see directly underneath the Thunderbird an orca. We do have one of our poles configured like that, and the orca was considered the ruler of the undersea world. Well, the Thunderbird was much more powerful than the orca. It was a massive bird of prey similar to an eagle, but it had a crested head, and it would reside in the mountains, but when it flapped its wings, it would produce thunder. Lightning would come. But just on our left, this area here, this was once the site of their type of mineral. Yeah, can you tell me what it is?
That's yellow.
Close, it's sulfur. And sulfur is a byproduct of the sour gas mines of northern Alberta and BC, where it's shipped down here by rail, where 170,000 tons of sulfur can be stockpiled at one time. When mixed with potash in the blue silos to the left of the by the First Nations. It was feared for its awesome potential for destructive forces and revered because of its the bridge is also known as the bridge that beer built because the Guinness family of the internationally renowned stout beer brand purchased the land to the north and to the west of the bridge for $75,000 back in 1890. Very exclusive area known as British properties. One had to have British citizenship in order to purchase land there at that time. And though no longer as exclusive today, it does remain some of the most expensive real estate here in Canada. Of Japan. The original figurehead can be seen at the mirror, and the oval are just behind the edge row there. Established here in 1890, very popular at that time, people would come from all over the city to see bicycle races and running races. Captain Stamp was unsuccessful in his mission to log the peninsula and the United States at that time. But it was permanently located here at Brockton Point in Stanley Park in 1894, where it would go off every night at, you guessed it, 9 p.m. And this was so ship's captain's dangerous job to do. He would take a fishing rod type apparatus, attach a stick of dynamite to it. He would detonate this over top of the seawall so ships could set their navigational equipment. And after many years of this dangerous work, it was replaced with the 9 o'clock gun. The 9 o'clock gun can be found just beyond the Harry Jerome statue. Here is a side note to this story. During the pandemic, we lost our supplier of gunpowder, so the gun fell silent for the first time in its history. It is back up and running now, and we can hear it report from just about anywhere in the city if we listen at 9 o'clock. And just over on our right, we see a statue of a girl on a rock. This is known as Girl in a Wetsuit. Back in the 1970s, prominent Vancouver lawyer Douglas Brown, in his international travels, came upon the Little Mermaid sculpture of Copenhagen, Denmark. And he thought to Vancouver and the sea. No, that's not. All right, boys. Whoa. Passage in both directions. Well, there were 3 White Empresses in the White Empress line, owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway, and they were the White Empress of Japan, the White Empress of China, and the White Empress of India. They sailed from Vancouver to ports of the East between 1891 and 1922, but between 1891 and 1906 they never missed a sailing, nor were they late. This made them very important in international cargo such as mail, silk, and tea. Silk was a very important commodity at that time before the advent of man-made fabrics, so it was taken straight off the ships, placed onto express trains, and expressed straight through Rock, which is a historic RCMP. This fiery dragon sculpture we see is a fiberglass copy of the original figurehead from the White Empress of Japan. The original figurehead can be seen in, although on some king high tides I have seen the water lapping up at her knees. Grit. But just to our right is the Lionsgate Bridge. It was named for the twin mountain peaks, the Lions, which were in turn named for the Trafalgar Square Lions of London. The original name of the mountain peaks was the Sisters by the First Nations, and they can be seen just atop of that cloud bank right there. Building type structure, it had columns made out of BC tree varietals, and it was used, one of a dozen, on a parade route for the visiting Duke and Duchess of Connaught back in 1912, where afterwards it was floated here by barge, where it stood for 35 years before being replaced with our current Lumberman's Arch on our left. Well, just a little excitement as we jog up the hill. But on our left here, this is a first growth cedar tree, which I mentioned. And it is about a 700-year-old tree. Would have then first been getting its 114 liters or 30 gallons of water every day. Months at this time. 3 areas which were home to First Nations people for thousands of years. This is the second largest of the 3 villages, known as the Shoy Shoy Village. And over time, a large midden or trash heap accumulated here, which mostly consisted of shells. To an industry that, well, back then it was just raw land and the lumber mill. One day, a steamship captain by the name of Gassy Jack Dayton, named for his penchant for tall tales and endless talk, he showed up one day with a barrel of whiskey in tow. Well, he told the workers anyone who helps build a saloon will get free drinks. Well, the saloon was up and running within a day, right on the property line of the lumber mill, and Gastown was born. What we needed from there were the trains to bring some more people into the area, and within a 12-block radius in the Gastown area around the turn of the century, there was 300 licensed establishments, so it was a early, young, western, raucous town. It was the early beginnings of Gastown and Vancouver. We'll just carry on. 426 feet below the surface underneath the Lionsgate Bridge. Ooh. cost of $3 million at that time, and it extended 16 kilometers from the Capilano watershed in North Vancouver to what is current-day Main Street. It was called Westminster Street back at that time, and today's ones that call BC home. 3 of these First Nations lay claim to Stanley Park and the surrounding area. They are the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh bands. To them, the cedar tree is a sacred tree known as the Tree of Life that will provide resources for them from cradle to grave. The outer bark was used to make rainproof capes and hats, while the inner bark was meant for residents to stow their garbage properly, go through the well-being of the humans as well as the bears. Every year we lose them for such events as rock concerts, sporting events, parades, and other special events. They have 7 constables and 9 horses. Many of their horses are draft horse crosses. We'll take the draft horse we have here today, cross them with a regular riding horse. They get the size and the temperament from the draft horse which they require. Just a little bit skinnier, more easily managed, and, well, easier to throw their legs around as they mount up. They are not, however, Royal Canadian Mounted Police or Mounties. As such, they do not wear the red serge jacket typical of the Mounties. Mounties, the beaver, started tunneling under the roadway and undermining the road that the park board said, these beaver have to go. Whose idea was that? And they removed them. Well, the beaver had another idea, mind you. They came back all the fertile base of the cedar stump as it biodegrades. And as it does so, the tree will send roots around the stump, leaving us with these interesting sculptural effects. Municipal force. And we're now in the Stanley Park Rose Garden. Here we find 50 plots with 40 different varieties as well as 3,000 individual rose bushes. It was established here in the 1920s by the Kiwanis Club. Just up ahead and on our left, an unusual looking tree. And this is an example of a western hemlock tree which has seeded from a cedar stump. Barely the tree was done by a pileated woodpecker. The western hemlock tree is another important tree to the First Nations, used as a hunger suppressant, as a dye which could be made into multiple colors, as well as a hide tanning agent due to the high tannin levels in the bark. And as we enter into the roundabout, as we look straight ahead, we see a lagoon. And this today is a freshwater lagoon, but prior to 1916, before the causeway or roadway was added, it was a tidal floodplain that would ebb and flow with the tides. Back then, our cultural ambassador and Canadian poet, Pauline Johnson, used to love to paddle her canoe through the area. Sometimes, due to the tides, it would be unavailable to her, so she wrote a poem entitled The Lost Lagoon. And the name The Lost Lagoon was added in 1922 after Pauline Johnson's passing in 1912. Pauline Johnson was buried here in the park, and her ashes were scattered by Third Beach, where there's a rocky cairn there to mark her memory. Hello. Well, if we look all the way up the hillside on our left, we see a statue of a man with outstretched arms. This man's name is Lord Stanley of Preston, the 16th Earl of Derby, and the namesake to our park. Lord Stanley was Governor General at the time. He dedicated the park on October 29th, 1889. Lord Stanley's dedication was to the use and enjoyment of people of all colors creeds, and customs for all time. But Lord Stanley also donated a hockey cup to the Ontario Hockey League in 1893. He donated the Dominion Hockey Challenge Cup, which later popularly became known as Stanley's Cup, then the Stanley Cup of the NHL in 1916. The original Gold Line Silver Cup became brittle over time. It was eventually replaced in 1963 with the current presentation cup we see in the NHL of today. Just over on our left here is a statue of the famous Scottish poet Robbie Burns. Robbie Burns was established here at great expense by the Burns Fellowship in 1928, as it is an exact copy of the original from Scotland. People will celebrate Robbie Burns Day every year on his birthday, January 25th, with the piping in of the haggis. On our left, this is the oldest monument in Vancouver. It is the second oldest in BC. It is a monument to Queen Victoria, established here in 1905, but dedicated May 24th, 1906, by the Premier of the province on the Queen's birthday and in the presence of Vancouver school children. Well, the school children were included because they helped raise funds for the monument by selling commemorative black bordered cards with the Queen's birth, coronation, and death on it, which sold for $10 back at that time. Pretty big money back then. Well, just to our right is the west end of Vancouver. This is one of the most densely populated areas of Canada, with about 100,000 people per square mile. And as we approach the end of our tour today, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of AAA Horse and Carriage Tours, on behalf of myself, Hal, as well as Jim and Britt. And if you'd like to say hi to the boys, perhaps take some more pictures or thank them, you are most welcome to do so. Please approach from the front of the Green Gate, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Stanley Park in Vancouver today. If you're interested in carrying on your adventures here in the park, we do offer discounted tickets to the aquarium. You can purchase your tickets at our booth to receive your discount, but also you'll not be bound by any kind of a time slot, which you may be bound by if you purchase online or at the aquarium itself. Look at that, one in and one out.
Boys. Yeah. Hi, good boy. Yeah. Oh.
So close to you.
Yeah. 今日坐馬車遊史丹尼公園呢，其實我哋只係遊咗1/3呢個公園嘅咋嚇，咁佢而家個馬車嘅行程就係咁樣，咁而家就翻嚟啦，咁我哋大致上面咧都睇到一啲呢個公園嘅1/3嘅景啦嚇，咁今日個分享咧就嚟到呢度啦，咁大家都唔需要順序咁去聽嘅嚇，呢個係規矩嚟嘅，好啦，下期再見。